respiratory illnesses. Despite becoming a global issue when the World Health Organization asked China for more information, citing a report on clusters of undiagnosed pneumonia in children by the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases. Joined by two experts that we leaned on heavily during the pandemic here on 680 CJOB, Raywat Deonandan from the University of Ottawa, where he is an epidemiologist. Don Bowdish is a professor in Pathology and Molecular Medicine Division at McMaster Immunology Research Center in Hamilton. Thank you to the both of you for joining us. Don, take us through fact and fiction here of what the Chinese are dealing with right now.
If you remember last year when we spoke around this time, we were having one of the most cruel cold and flu seasons for children that we had ever had. There were waiting rooms that were filling. There was shortages of cold and flu medication. And we think in retrospect that was partially because coming out of the pandemic and with the pandemic restrictions, there was sort of a generation of new children who hadn't had the same exposure to many respiratory infections. And so, as an example, RSV is a virus where generally you do worse the first time. And generally, that first exposure is before you're 2 years old. So most of the children admitted to hospital for RSV are under 2 years old. But there'd been a whole gap where both in last year we were having the 0 to 2 crowd, but also the 2 to 4 crowd having their first exposure. And so there was sort of a double cohort. So China had very strict restrictions around COVID that they lifted. And our best guess is that what they're experiencing is what we had last year, where they're having higher than average admissions for children and young people to a variety of viruses, not that they're having some sort of outbreak due to some new and novel pathogen.
So, Raywat Deonandan, we shouldn't be concerned?
We should always be a little bit, anxious looking around the world. We're in a new era of infectious disease, possibly. But Dr. Bowdish is absolutely correct. Now is not the time for that kind of worry. There are no signs that there is a novel pathogen at work here, like COVID 2023, right? There's good news and bad news. The good news is there's no sign of a new pathogen. The bad news is that kids in China are going to struggle. Among the pathogens that might be responsible for this surge, RSV was mentioned, COVID possibly, mycoplasma pneumonia likely. And that's one that doesn't get enough news play, but that's one that we need to know more about because mycoplasma outbreaks do occur every few years. And China has a higher incidence of the type that is a little bit antibiotic resistant, so that might be driving some of the hospital traffic they're seeing there. So yeah, absolutely, there's no need for any kind of concern at this point. Let the experts do the expert thing and just wait.
Is there any concern out of the UK, Ray, where they're talking about a first human case of H1N2, that's a type of swine flu?
Yeah, influenzas are kind of scary to me. And what we care about with looking at avian influenza and swine influenza is whether or not there's human-to-human transmission. I've not heard that that's the case. The disease jumps, relatively commonly from animals to humans, but the question is, has it achieved the required mutation to make it an epidemic strain? That is not clear. So again, no need to panic yet.
Don Bowdish, doesn't look like either you or Ray are going to be out of work anytime soon as we continue to talk about all of these different illnesses. So let's talk a little bit about preventing them. There is a vaccine available. Some of us have had it on board for well over a month. Of course, there's the flu vaccine every year as well. Would the COVID vaccine be considered a booster, or is it being considered a new vaccine? Because, again, it's got some different strains in there.
Oh, I love that you asked that question because I think this is so important for people to be aware of. I keep telling people you can stop counting your vaccines. There's no magic number and you're done because of the COVID virus has mutated to the point where it doesn't resemble that ancestral virus that we were originally vaccinated against. If the wording in the National Advisory Council on Immunization is very clear that we're not calling it a booster anymore, we're calling it a matched vaccine. So just like you wouldn't go and get an influenza vaccine for some influenza strain that circulated 10 years ago, you get the one that's matched or the best match for the current circulating strain. And that's what we have to think about our COVID vaccinations. One big difference between the COVID vaccines and the influenza vaccines is influenza season lasts about 6 months, and you generally get about 60%, if on a good year, protection from symptomatic infection. That decreases by about 10% a month. So you get one shot a year because your flu shot covers you for that 6 months. COVID, on the other hand, doesn't show any sign of moving to a once-a-year strategy. So it's entirely possible that we'll need multiple updates per year. But let's not call it a booster ever again. Let's just call it the best match to the circulating strains that we currently have.
Raywat, what's the data telling us about take-up on these shots? Because there's a certain exhaustion post-pandemic to go out and do this. Are we going out and doing what we should be doing?
We are not. In Ontario, where I live, it's about 6% of the population has received the new monovalent, not booster, the new matched vaccine. In the US, it's more like 10%. Nationally, I'm not aware what the Canadian data shows, but it's probably somewhere between 6 and 10%. That's very poor. And I blame the messaging around this. And I blame, again, people's aren't even aware that new one exists and that it's different from the previous versions and that there are new circulating strains that need to be combated. So we must do better.
I'll let you both weigh in, but we'll begin with Dawn. RSV vaccine, which is not available for the little ones, unfortunately, but it is available for seniors. But it's pricey, about $300 a pop, if you will. Should this be covered? I know that's kind of a political question, but asking seniors, my parents are a prime example. $600 is a lot to ask seniors to be able to put out, especially if they don't have insurance coverage for it.
Listen, I'm not afraid to get political, and I'm going to say that yes. And I think one of the success stories in vaccination in my province of Ontario was a few years ago, before our Conservative government got elected, retirement groups and older adult groups petitioned to get access to the high-dose influenza vaccine because that's the best influenza vaccine. And I was absolutely gobsmacked that made it into an election promise, but it did. And now that's available to older adults in our province. RSV is really serious. Not only is the infection bad for older adults, but it's associated with more heart attacks and long-term health issues than influenza is. So if we support influenza vaccination, we should absolutely be supporting RSV vaccination. And I'd really encourage your listeners to get a little political themselves and help lobby to make sure this is front of mind of our politicians to get it funded for older adults. It's worth every penny.
Last word to you, Raywat. Do you see this being extended to little ones in the future?
Not this vaccine necessarily. There are other vaccines that are being trialed for children. It's going to take a while for the data to come through. But I want to echo Don's sentiments there. Absolutely, they should be paid for. What are we doing here if not extending free vaccines to the people who most need it and who are least likely to be able to pay for it? Just sometimes the decisions made in the public health realm just boggle my mind.
Yeah, $300 for a vaccine wouldn't even get you through the door, I'm sure, at an ED or urgent care. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Dawn Bowdish, Professor in Pathology and Molecular Medicine Division at McMaster Immunology Research Center in Hamilton. Raywat Deonandan, University of Ottawa, Epidemiologist.